Hello class. I want to try to give a short lecture about the Constitution. This is hard for me. In a normal class we might talk for 2 or 3 days about this. So I want to try to distill my message into 3 main points here that I think are relevant for our discussion that we're having this week about the Constitution. You've already, or should have already, read some documents, and if you haven't, that's good too, because hopefully my talk here will help you understand the documents that I've asked you to read this week revolving around the Constitution. Here are my 3 main points. The first is that we should just recognize that our current Constitution, which was drafted in 1787, implemented in 1789, that was not our first Constitution. Remember, the Declaration of Independence occurs in 1776, and the first Constitution that we have is something called the Articles of Confederation, created in 1777. So for over 10 years, America operates under a Constitution that is different than our current Constitution. Going off of that point is the recognition that you should realize that our current Constitution, the one I just said, is created in 1787 and ratified in 1789. Let me see, I want to use a pen here. This will be good. So right here, our current Constitution, which by the way was not created with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights were added later. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we hold so dear, like the First Amendment, Second Amendment, etc. That was not original to the Constitution. But the point here that I'm making is that our current Constitution, in the context of that time, was actually not creating a template to weaken federal government or federal power, but rather creating a template to make the federal government stronger than had existed under the Articles of Confederation. And I'll help explain that here in a minute. The final point that I want to make, that I think is really, really important, is that the Constitution is not self-evident, meaning that it's a document of words that can be interpreted different ways. It's much like the Bible. Do you think the Bible has been interpreted the same way by all people? Absolutely not. It is subject to different interpretations. This is true of the Constitution, and it's true of the Constitution not only today, but even at the time, that people like Jefferson and Hamilton, as you already know if you've read that document about them arguing over the National Bank, they could not agree on how to interpret the Constitution. This is a really important point for our current day, in that some people seem to think that there is one view of the Constitution, and they say, well, just follow the Constitution. Well, what does that mean? It's not as easy as you think, and that we can have good faith disagreements about how to interpret the Constitution, and we can still be all good patriotic Americans. But some people think it's so simple. Oh, there's the Constitution. Well, if those people actually went and read the Constitution themselves, I think they would realize that it is not so simple. Okay, in order to get context for the Constitution, you need to understand our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which came before the first 10 years, actually the first 12 years of our nation operated under the Articles of Confederation. The first point about that is that it created a system that was very decentralized federal power. And when I talk about federal power, I'm talking about the national government, the federal government versus state power, which is a really important component of our current and the debate that existed then over the Constitution. The big question is, who has sovereignty or power? That word means power. Is it the states? Is it the federal government? Well, it's pretty clear in the Articles of Confederation. Actually, let me show you. Get out of this for a second, and if I can get out of it for a second. No, well, let's just discard for now. If we get out of this for a second and we go to your book, actually, I'll show you. This is your textbook. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm in the appendix, And in the appendix you have the Declaration of Independence, you have the Articles of Confederation, you have the Constitution, the amendments to the Constitution. And here in section A3 you can read Article 2 for yourself, which says, no, maybe you can't read this on the screen that you're seeing. I'm not sure how big it is. You can, by the way, enlarge this particular presentation, get rid of my face and get rid of anything else extraneous and make the PowerPoint and what I'm showing on the screen the biggest part. And you'll be able to read in A3 at the end of your book that Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation says each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. In other words, states' rights are central to the Articles of Confederation. So let's go back to our PowerPoint slide here. The national government was the Continental Congress during that time, and the Continental Congress had the power to conduct foreign wars and to borrow and issue money. They borrowed a lot of money. They went in debt to fight the Revolutionary War. They issued a lot of money, like Confederate dollars, which became basically worthless because there was nothing really behind them. And as you'll see in a second, the Articles of Confederation didn't have very much power. It didn't have the power to tax, for instance. It didn't have the power to raise revenue. So it was very limited. Here's what it couldn't do. It couldn't levy taxes. It could not regulate trade in and among and between the states. It could not draft troops, in other words, raise an army. Now, it could conduct an army. There was a Continental Army. You say, well, where did that come from? Well, it came from the states. The states drafted troops and provided their troops to be directed by the Continental Army under the command of George Washington, but the federal government could not draft troops. There was no executive. Sure, there was a president of the Continental Congress, but that was like the Speaker of the House today. That person was not an executive authority with discretionary powers. There's no president, prime minister, king, czar, anything. There was no executive branch. There was only one branch of government during the Articles of Confederation period, and that was the legislative branch, and that was reflected in the Continental Congress. There's no national court system. Today we have federal courts. We have district courts, circuit courts. We have courts of appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. Nothing like that existed. All judicial power resided within the states, not the federal government. And this created a lot of problems. Just for example, and I can't list all the problems here and do this in a short lecture. You can read your book about the section on the Articles of Confederation and the problems that existed underneath that. There were all kinds of problems. There was the inability of that government to assert itself on an international level in terms of diplomacy. There was an inability of that government to raise a standing army and protect its own borders against threats from Native Americans or even of course afterwards from the British themselves. We're going to go right into the early national period where the British have not even evacuated the interior of the country. Well, okay, let me just give this one example of economic concerns. With the Articles of Confederation, there was no national coordination of economic policy, no trade policy. Like today, we have a national trade policy. Our federal government can implement tariffs and trade agreements with different nations. There was no ability to do this under the Articles of Confederation. Each state, in fact, was like its own country. Virginia would have to deal with England or France in order to negotiate import-export agreements and such. And in fact, the states among themselves put up tariffs, and things became very, very complicated. There was a large national debt that the Articles of Confederation couldn't do anything about, really, because even though it owed a lot of money, it could not raise money. It could not raise revenue. All of these things helped to contribute to a chaotic period economically after the war. There was a severe economic depression. There were British goods flooding the American market. American farmers were hurting. Farmers were being foreclosed on their land. Farmers who had fought in the Revolution and had been paid with Confederate dollars or government IOUs that were not accepted by many of the states. This was the case, for example, in Massachusetts. And the result of this disorder and chaos was an internal rebellion in the state of Massachusetts. You can read about it in your book called Shays' Rebellion, led by Daniel Shays, and involving a bunch of farmers, most of whom were veterans of the American Revolution. Things were getting a little bit out of control. I'm moving fast just to make some of these connections, which again you can read about in your book and flesh out the bigger picture. But the impact of Shays' Rebellion on creating a new constitution was important, because it was after Shays' Rebellion that many of the elites in America, people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, believed that we needed to create a stronger national government. We didn't even have a federal force that could go into western Massachusetts if it so wanted and create order there, suppress an indigenous revolution. So many people begin to wonder, wow, do we need a stronger government in order to ensure order and stability within our borders? Alexander Hamilton especially wanted a stronger federal government in order to take care of some of the economic problems. He wanted to be able to tax and regulate trade and clean things up. So the point here is that the Constitutional Convention that's going to be convened in 1787, and let me get my pointer going here. The Continental Convention that's going to be presided over by George Washington comes about as a result. Here's Washington writing a letter. I'm trying to think of who he's writing this letter to at the time. And the full text of it, he's talking about his fear after Shays' Rebellion that there are these combustibles in every state which spark might set fire to. He says, good God, we need to do something about this. And it's George Washington who gets behind this idea of needing to meet in Philadelphia, 1787, a convention that was already scheduled, but there wasn't much excitement or buzz in the colonies around it, not the colonies anymore, but in the states around it. Then it's George Washington lending his considerable legitimacy and power and weight to that convention, which he's going to preside over, that helps to bring some momentum to this effort to create a stronger national government. So the context of our Constitution wasn't to create a more limited government. Yes, if you compare it with what existed in a monarchy, certainly yes. But if you compare it to what came before, and that's the Articles of Confederation, the context is very different than that. It's a period whereby many people just believe, hey, we need to have a stronger federal union. So the Constitutional Convention, then, the ostensible purpose, or the superficial purpose, I guess, is to revise the Articles, but that doesn't happen. What comes out of it is an entirely new Constitution. We should realize that only 55 delegates drafted our Constitution. This wasn't something that the whole population participated in. In fact, there were a lot of the founding fathers that were not even there at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson and Adams were overseas. People like Patrick Henry, the great patriot from the state of Virginia, who said, give me liberty or give me death. And of course, that was way back in 1765 during this Stamp Act crisis. But Henry, and like many others, were very skeptical of what was going to be happening in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. He believed that it was about consolidating the central power of the federal government at the expense of the states, and he refused to attend. George Washington, of course, presided, as I mentioned, and this is a very, very streamlined view of what happens here, but let's just say that there were two extremes which were represented at the Constitutional Convention, there was Patterson's New Jersey plan, and the New Jersey plan was little different from the Articles. I can't write with this, so I was going to write Articles. I can't do it. Let me see, Articles. Oh gosh, that doesn't work. Anyway, in other words, it was a template based upon the Articles of Confederation that essentially didn't change much. I mean, it didn't create a executive power and authority. It didn't create a national court system. It did expand some of the powers of the federal government, or the continental Congress. But it was still essentially a template for state power rather than federal power. On the other side was Hamilton's plan, which is pretty amazing. If you want to look up Hamilton's plan for the State of the Union, it's pretty amazing. He essentially wants to create like a monarchical republic. He says there should be a president, but the president should be a president for life. So here's the monarchy aspect to it. That there should be senators and they should be elected for life. That the president, again, the lifelong elected president, should be able to veto anything that Congress passes. These kinds of things. So this was an extreme view, a template for a very strong federal power. That created a middle ground whereby Madison's Virginia plan could come to the forefront as almost a compromise solution. And the Virginia plan essentially lays out that template of what is going to become our Constitution, and that is a bicameral legislature that divides power, and a balanced government where you have separation of powers between an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. That's what ends up coming about. So there were, of course, a lot of problems, but I'm only dealing with a few of them. I'm not even really dealing with the question of race and slavery, which is huge. I'm not going to deal with that because primarily we're focusing upon this debate over sovereignty and federal power versus state power and things like that. There are a lot of other questions about race and citizenship that come out of the Constitution that are obviously unresolved and won't be resolved until after the Civil War, and we'll get to that later. So, problems and resolutions: small states versus large states. This was a big problem. The solution was the so-called Great Compromise, which created a bicameral legislature, which gave every state 2 seats in the upper chamber, the Senate. So all states got the same equal representation in the Senate, and of course that meant that all states had the same authority in terms of passing laws, because a little state like a New Hampshire could block an initiative by a big state like Virginia or New York in the Senate, where they had equal representation. And yet big states like Virginia and New York had more power in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives. There were other problems and solutions. Where ultimately does sovereignty lie? Well, sovereignty lies with the people, and then powers are going to be divided between state and federal governments. This is still not clear as to how these powers are always divided up. That's why it's a part of our ongoing debates that we have over the Constitution. A big question, of course, is how do you prevent a federal government from becoming tyrannical like England had seemingly become in the period before the American Revolution, the reason for the revolution in the first place. And that was solved by this template of a government that had checks and balances, where you had separated powers, where you had, again, judicial, executive, legislative branches which could play off of each other with veto power and the power to impeach and the power to override vetoes and all kinds of things. And of course, the other thing was to put a Bill of Rights in there to protect individual rights from overbearing government authority, and so that was done in 1791. Keep in mind, though, that our first Constitution is ratified without a Bill of Rights, and that some people like Jefferson and also Madison later believed that the Bill of Rights was really important, but other people like Hamilton believed that we don't need a Bill of Rights. So these founding fathers could not always agree on things, and they compromised. They compromised their views, and they got things done, which is really important, I think, in light of our current political situation, the extent to which people who didn't agree were able to come to some kind of compromise in the interests of the good of the nation. So, all easy, right? They compromised, they came together, they figured it out, they solved their differences between states and federal power, and they didn't address real controversial stuff like slavery, and so here it is. They signed it, they ratified it. Wow, great stuff. Well, actually, they didn't ratify it yet. They just created the document, and wait a minute, not so easy. In fact, what ensued after the creation of the document in the summer of 1787 was a huge debate over ratification. The nation and the founding fathers themselves could not agree on this Constitution. Many people were adamantly opposed to it. These anti-federalists that I've had you read, you should realize that there's these factions. The Federalists are the people who promote the creation of this new, stronger federal government under the Constitution. This is John Jay, who will become actually the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is Alexander Hamilton, who will become the first Secretary of the Treasury. Was an adamant, fierce proponent of stronger national power. I mean, read Hamilton and Washington on the Whiskey Rebellion in the back of this chapter in your book. You'll see that Hamilton had a very broad view of federal power and federal authority. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Here's James Madison. I'm sorry. I was saying John Jay. I was looking at James Madison. Of course, really the author of the template for the Constitution. And then here's John Jay, who would become the first Justice of the Supreme Court. So this debate of over ratification then took the form of these opposing views of the Federalists, like Hamilton. Madison later changes to become an anti-Federalist, or a Jeffersonian Republican, as it was called, or a Democratic Republican, as it was called. As under Jefferson, you have the creation under Jefferson and Adams of really this first party system of political parties in the United States, which, by the way, are not mentioned in the Constitution. Political parties are not in the Constitution. Many of the Founding Fathers were against that, but what we're going to see is that there's a kind of factional divide, if we just draw a line here, between those people who support the Constitution over here, the Federalist. At first, Madison, later, he's going to be an anti-federalist, but we just don't worry about that yet. But Hamilton, especially, George Washington, John Jay, people who become proponents of a little more federal power, the ability of a federal government to tax, the ability of a federal government to regulate commerce, to draft troops, people who are saying United States versus States United, which was a debate. People were saying we the people in the preamble to the Constitution versus we the states. That, in fact, was a debate as well. And so over here you have the anti-federalists, and Jefferson was sort of in this crowd also. He was really skeptical, and of course Patrick Henry was. So many others were. Yates, Lansing, Clinton. All these people I'm having you read, they were advocates of states' rights. They were advocates of limiting the power of the federal government and promoting the interests of states. If you look at your book on page 206 in the discussion of political cultures, you'll find out that it was very close in many of these states as to whether they were going to ratify this Constitution or not. Look at Virginia's 89 for, 79 against. Look at New York. I'm looking for New York. It's 34-27 against. That's 3 votes. Look at Massachusetts. It's a 187 for, 168 against. The nation is divided over whether we should create this new Constitution or not. Many people say yes, we need it. We need to expand the powers of the federal government. give them the ability to tax, regulate commerce, draft troops, organize things. Other people, and these guys over here, say, no, it's going to be too much federal power. So this is the nature of the debate. We know it does pass. We know it does go through, but that's not the end of the debates, because we still continue the debate after the federal government is created under the new Constitution. We still continue the debate with the Founding Fathers arguing over the national bank, and even to this day we continue the debates. The big debate, I think, that resounds, and still to this day, if you look at most of the Supreme Court decisions, they involve federal power versus state power. Who has the right to do what? Does the federal government have a right to enact a healthcare law? Can states block that? Well, our conservative majority Supreme Court has said yes, they do have the right to do that, because things like, for instance, the Supremacy Clause, but things like the Commerce Clause, which I'll talk about in a second, of the Constitution, give the federal government the right to regulate commerce in and among and between the states. And if you think that healthcare is commerce, which it certainly is, and that it operates on an interstate basis, which it certainly does, then the federal government has every right to enact laws that regulate that, and so forth. That's what the Supreme Court has said. Yet we're still going to debate it, and there's a good debate to be had there. I mean, is it a good law? That's not really the same question as is the law constitutional. We can pass bad laws that are constitutional, and so you should recognize that. Let's just look at this federal power versus state power. What can the federal government do? What can states do? This is, again, still debated. Things like marijuana, things like the right to die, the Oregon law about assisted suicide. These are things where the federal government and states can come into conflict with each other. Drug laws and things like that. And we're just kind of hashing these things out still today. I'm going to get out of this for a second, and I'm going to show you the document. We'll just discard my my annotations. So here's our document, which I've posted for you, and it's in your module. It's our Constitution. It's without the Bill of Rights, because when it was created in 1787, it didn't have the Bill of Rights. So just if you look in our Constitution, and you can see the Bill of Rights, by the way, at the end of your book as well. If you go to Article 1, well, no, sorry, first we were at Supremacy Clause. So go to the very end, Article 6, and you'll find there the Supremacy Clause. Let me reduce this down a little bit. And in the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, you see it says, "This Constitution, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made of which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." Right? That Whiskey Rebellion debate in the 1790s, farmers in western Massachusetts don't like that tax against whiskey. But, as we'll see in a second, the federal government has the right to tax. It's passed through Congress. It is the law of the land, and the Supremacy Clause says it's the supreme law of the land. And so this has been interpreted as saying that states don't have the right to contravene federal law that has been deemed constitutional and so forth. And when the federal government passes something that's within its constitutional right, states don't have the right. They can certainly try, and they can make a debate. Maybe the law can be changed, but these are the kinds of issues that take us right into the Civil War. Do states have the right to, well, even secede from the Union? Do they have the right to nullify federal laws? This is a really important and ongoing debate. The Supremacy Clause is one part of it, which would argue on behalf of the federal government over the states. The 10th Amendment is the other part of it, and if we go to back to your textbook and we go down to the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution, and we look at the 10th Amendment, it says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states. And basically that's saying that any power that's not explicitly delegated to the federal government is reserved for the states, and states' rights and limited government advocates are going to look at the 10th Amendment and see that as a centerpiece for their argument. Of course, the question is, what powers are delegated to the federal government through the Constitution? And that's a big source of ongoing debate. So we've got the Supremacy Clause and the 10th Amendment here, and let me get my pen back here in a second. Okay, so we've talked about the Supremacy Clause. I'm sorry I'm going so fast. You're going to have to look into these yourself. You're going to have to look at that document that I posted for you. You're going to have to read in your book, and you're going to have to maybe listen to this again or ask me questions if you have questions. I'm just trying to give you a sense that there's these ongoing debates between the power of the federal government and the power of states, the Supremacy Clause being those who would say federal power trumps state power, and the 10th Amendment being the argument for those who say that state power is, equal to at least federal power. But the question is, what can the federal government do? What are the powers of the federal government? Well, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, for example, you'll see that the federal government can regulate commerce. The federal government can tax, and that the federal government can do anything that it deems necessary and proper in terms of carrying out all of its powers, and those powers include very general statements like providing for the common defense and the general welfare. And so the debate between Jefferson and Hamilton over the national bank ranges around this point of, again, federal power versus state power and what is constitutional. Jefferson is going to focus upon the 10th Amendment, and he's going to focus upon a literal and limited interpretation of the Constitution to say, if something is not listed in Article 1, Section 8, which is the enumerated powers of the Constitution, if something's not actually listed there, then it's not constitutional. He says the national bank isn't there, listed there, it's not constitutional. Hamilton, on the other hand, takes a broader view and a less literal view, and he says, well, the Constitution says that the federal government can do anything necessary and proper in terms of carrying out its general powers, and those powers include, providing for the general welfare. Those powers include regulating commerce, and if such is the case, the bank can help that, and the bank is therefore constitutional. So this is just a good faith debate between two of our founding fathers over, what can the federal government do? What are the powers? And they're looking at the same document and they're interpreting it different. This is so important to recognize, and that goes to my earlier three main points that I began this with, that the Constitution is not absolutely, perfectly clear and self-evident. It is subject to interpretation. It has been since the very beginning, and it still is today. This is all right. In fact, this is what we do. We debate as a democratic nation the nature of our Constitution. This is okay. Let me go back again to the Constitution, and let's go up real quick and look at that Article 1, Section 8, which is the enumerated powers of Congress. And here it is, Article 1, Section 8, and it begins with Congress shall, and I can make this a little bit larger, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Okay, Congress can tax, and to pay. Congress can pass laws to allow it to tax, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, excises shall be uniform. Okay. So, and it also says, here's the Commerce Clause, that Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That has been interpreted to say that anything that's interstate commerce, Congress has the power to regulate. So these two things together would, suggest pretty broad powers. If you add to that, and of course here are all the specific things that Jefferson would say, well, gosh, there's no national bank, listed here. Of course, what what Hamilton would say is, well, we can regulate commerce, we can coin money, we can do all these things which are necessary, and the bank can help us do those things. And so we should be able to do that. Hamilton looks at this clause, the necessary and proper clause. He says, look, we can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And again, those foregoing powers include these general statements about regulating commerce, about even providing for the common defense and general welfare. So a very broad view of the Constitution is that you can pass anything and it's constitutional as long as the people agree and through their elected representatives pass through democratically and through a constitutionally mandated process laws which provide for the common defense and the general welfare. So that's one argument there. Of course, other people say no, we need to have a more limited view. And of course, under that limited view, if it's not listed here, you can't do it. That would really mean that all the programs enacted in the 20th century, for example, and I don't just mean Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the current healthcare law and so forth, but I mean there are all kinds of things not mentioned that we have today, even including security apparatus. I mean, hey, the CIA, the NSA, these things aren't mentioned in our Constitution, neither is the Air Force, and I'm being a little bit funny there. Obviously, planes don't exist. And so we have adapted, we have amended the Constitution, we have changed the Constitution because the founders provided a way to change it. They provided a process for amending it, which we have followed to expand on our original Constitution. But these debates will continue. They won't go away, and they really shouldn't. It's the nature of democratic society that we should debate these things. All kinds of things still subject to debate, including, again, religion, the whole question of the role of Christianity in our founding. I have given you a pretty provocative discussion question this week, which is meant to just incite provocative debate. And the debate really revolves around this question of the role of Christianity in the new republic. Clearly, Christianity is the majority religion. We are a nation of Christians. That is, I don't think, possible to debate. The question that can be debated is, to what extent did the Founding Fathers, who were Christians, want to see Christianity perpetuated by law in our founding documents? And that's an interesting question, because if you read the Constitution, and let's go back to the Constitution. Well, no, actually first, well, okay, yes, let's look at our Constitution. If you read the Constitution, you're going to find, and I encourage you to do this, that nowhere in our Constitution is there a mention of God or religion, except, and the only mention of religion in the body of the Constitution, and this doesn't include the amendments, is one place, and that's the 6th article, where it says that that there shall be no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. It would seem to me, if the Founding Fathers had wanted to create a nation which was guided, I don't want to say guided, but whereby Christians had to run the nation, why couldn't they just put that? In fact, instead of putting no religious test shall be ever required as qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, couldn't they have certainly said, but citizenship and office holding should be dependent upon one being a Christian? Why not? But they didn't do that. So that's an interesting question, because they were Christians, but they didn't do that. They didn't put Christianity into this Constitution. Again, I encourage you to find it, because I'm not making the argument that they weren't Christians or committed Christians, and that they didn't see that as really important to their lives and even the life of the nation. But why didn't they put it in our founding document? Now, they did put it in the Bill of Rights. So if we go over to the Bill of Rights and we go to the First Amendment, we do see religion mentioned. We don't see God mentioned, we see religion mentioned, and this is another place where you're going to find it then. And the Establishment Clause says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's interesting too, because in other words, what establishment means at that time is, should there be a state church? Should there be, should we establish Christianity or one branch of Christianity as a state religion? Here they're saying no. And Jefferson later writes to a Baptist congregation up in New Hampshire this letter. And by the way, there's nothing in the Constitution which also says there's a wall of separation between church and state. That does not exist in the Constitution. But Jefferson does write a letter to the congregation up there, a Baptist congregation, and he says, we meant, when we created the First Amendment and the Constitution, we meant to create a wall of separation. That was his interpretation of the Constitution. And this is still debated, of course, but I think one thing is clear, is that they meant there to be no state religion. I mean, that's just clear. You can't abridge the free exercise of religion. You can't establish a state religion. Why did they do that? And I think what's interesting is, to put it in historical context, people who were in support of this were people like the Baptists in places like Virginia, because the Baptists were persecuted by the Anglicans. And so for those minority religions at that time who did not want to be persecuted, they recognized that we needed to have a nation of religious liberty, of religious freedom. And that's a really important point that we should recognize about our founding. That the founding fathers never intended for religion to be forcible or state mandated, and I think that's just very clear by our Constitution. But I welcome you to make good faith arguments against that point, because I'm interpreting the Constitution here, and you can read it and interpret it your own ways, but you need to have some evidence for that as well. So that's it. That comes to the end of my my lecture. I know there's a lot of material involved there, and it's really important material. And I'm very passionate that we debate the Constitution, that we read the Constitution, and that we understand that the Constitution is part of an ongoing debate. It was then, it still is today. Our founding fathers argued over it. We still will today. Have a good day. I hope this didn't go on too long, and I hope most of you got through this.